say something?
Hello, hello, testing, 1, 2, 3, meow.
Jacket. Ooh. This is the big part and the long part, but not the scary part.
It's not that scary. It is the hardest one out of the shirt and trouser, but it's fine.
It's fine.
It's fine, relax.
It's all right. Yeah. So we need to work in clever sequences, otherwise things will get even more complicated. First things first is to note down all of the alterations that we need to do. We need to shorten the jacket by 3 3/4 inches. We need to shorten the sleeve by 3 1/4 inches. We need to narrow the back shoulder by 1/2 inch. Take in the underarm cut, 1/2 inch on the double at the top to a line that goes into nothing at the pocket. We need to move our button in so that we're wrapping the coat by 2 inches. So that was the overlap, the excess of overlap that we needed to do in order to reduce the amount of chest in the coat. And lastly, we need to narrow the sleeve by 1/2 inch on the double all the way down. So it won't be possible to do it all the way on the double, considering that we have our button cuff in place there, but we'll displace it a little bit like we did on the trouser and get more out of the undersleeve than the top sleeve. But we'll come to that when we do the sleeves. The last thing we need to make sure that we have a note of is how much we need to narrow the quarters by. So the quarters are this section here in the coat. And remember, because we wrapped the coat over more than it usually would be wrapped, so rather than it buttoning here, so usually it buttons 1 inch back. So rather than it wrapping like this, we're wrapping it like that. We need to clear the quarters over here where we've got our chalk marks so that there's a gap at the bottom of the coat. And so we're just going to make a note of that. Measure down 5 inches from the second button. We need to open the quarters by 3/4 of an inch. So 5 inches down from second button, open quarters, 3/4 of an inch. Cool, so we made our notes. The first thing to do is to secure all the linings down. So we're going to baste them in around all of the elements that are going to come undone so that they are fixed in place, and this makes it easier for us to sew them back down once we come to that point. So we start off by taking out all of our pins, now that we made a note of all of those alterations. And we can now begin tacking the linings in place. So the first thing we want to do is secure them around the sleeve, but we're going to have to gain access to this seam. So what we're going to do is we're going to leave ourselves a gap from this seam so that we can still get into it and take it in. Grab a baste and then come from that underarm cut about a good 2.5 inches away and start putting a baste in all the way through the jacket. That also sits about a good 1.5 inches away from the armhole. So I'm 1.5 inches away from the armhole, and I'm a good 2.5 inches away from the underarm cut. And here you can start coming all the way through the jacket. As you can see, my needle coming through there and that base coming in to secure the linings in place. And as you can see, I'm staying away from the armhole still. And I'm coming through all the layers, catching the entire jacket. Make sure that as you're doing this, you're keeping the linings flat in place and not causing them to bunch up. Might be a bit difficult getting all the way in through the shoulder pad. Right, so we're staying a good couple inches away from the underarm cut, so I can stop basting them from this point onwards. And then we're going to baste the sleeve linings. So at the crown here, we're going to pop a couple of pad stitches about 3 inches down from the top of the sleeve. Like that. Going to do the same thing on the undersleeve and secure the linings in this location. And then we're going to want to secure the linings down across the bottom of the jacket. We know that we're going to shorten our jacket by 3 3/4 inches. So I want my base to secure my linings to sit about 1.5 inches on top of that. So if my coat is finishing at 3 3/4 inches, I add 1.5 inches. So that's 5.5 inches. And I make some little marks 5.5 inches up, which is the level at which I'm going to be securing my lining down, like that. We're also going to stay a good couple of inches away from the front edge over here. So we're going to start basting it in place around here. So a good few inches away over there. Make sure everything's lying flat and then baste away. And then again, stay away from here a little bit and just finish your tack over there. So now what we're going to do is take away all of our chalk marks. And we're going to start by taking our jacket apart, starting by removing the sleeve. Before we do take the sleeve out, however, once we come to this point here, where the forearm meets the body of the coat, we're just going to make a little mark, just like that over there. And then what that's going to allow us to do is make sure that the angle that the sleeve sits at remains the same. Quickly run a little stitch to mark that placement so that you've got the chalk mark permanently in place and we don't lose that bit of information.
That's called the pitch.
That's called the pitch. There. Start from the inside and you're going to remove the lining first. So the sleeve's now undone, and you'll notice that you'll see all the gubbins that are in the coat. So the first thing we want to do is remove the stitch line that is connecting all of these elements in. There may be more than one stitch line in place. So what you can see here is sleeve head wadding. So this is one of the elements that's enabling that little roll or puff on the top of the sleeve. So that needs to come out. We need to make sure we keep it. And then layered in here are your shoulder pad and the canvases, which constitute the internal structure of the coat, which will be laid bare in a second. So first things first is we remove the sleeve head wadding. It might be that this is attached in one stitch along with the sleeve or separately with its own stitch. In any case, both stitches, if there are more than one, need to come out. So only pull on this if the stitch is weak and it's not going to rip the sleeve head wadding there. So that's out. So that was stitched in separately. So now I'm going to come in and take the actual sleeve out. Undo a couple of the stitches from the top. Once those are out, then we can start freeing up the sleeve. Sometimes it helps to go from the other side and slowly undo it. But make sure that you're being delicate here.
How would you rate this alteration on the difficulty scale?
This is up there.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's like putting a sleeve back in is a...
So yeah, it's not an easy job.
Yeah.
But it's doable.
Yeah.
Just take it slowly. But yeah, we're not trying to make things look perfect, we're trying to make them look good.
Yes.
So now we have our sleeve out, we're going to alter it. We need to take it in a 1/2 inch on the double all the way down our hind arm, so at the back here to narrow the sleeve. And we also need to shorten it by 3 1/4 inches from the bottom. The sleeve and the armhole have a very close relationship. The sleeve needs to be ever so slightly bigger than the armhole for it to fit in. That ever so slight, we can get into detail, usually lies in the 6% region. But what we need to worry about is simply ensuring that if we're taking in the jacket a certain amount in the armhole, we're taking in the sleeve by that same amount. We're going to be taking in the underarm cut, that is to say, this section here, a 1/2 inch on the double in. So we're going to be reducing the armhole by 1 inch circumference total. We need to make sure that if we do that to the armhole, we do the same thing to the sleeve. It was fortunate for us that Luka wanted a narrower sleeve, which means that we can also take this in by that same amount and then have no problems putting the sleeve back into the jacket. If we were to take in the underarm cut on the jacket over here, right at the top, and not take in the sleeve would then be 1 inch too big to fit into the jacket, and it would start ruching and pleating in order to be able to go into the coat. So if you're altering the coat and you're taking it in right to the very top, either on the underarm cut or on the side seam, make sure that you make the same alteration to the sleeve to make up for the loss in width that's occurring, or the loss in circumference that's occurring through the armhole. So whatever alteration you do here, you also do there. Now, we don't take in this, we take in this. It's unwise to start changing this run here and this seam here because it affects a number of other things. So when you're taking in a sleeve, you will almost 99% of the time be taking it in on the hind arm. If you were happy with the width of the sleeve at the bottom, then you could just take it in at the hind arm to nothing at the cuff. However, Luka wanted a narrower sleeve all the way through, so we're going to take it in that 1 inch or 1/2 inch on the double all the way down. Now, how are we going to do this? Much like the trouser, we're going to displace the seam ever so slightly because, as you can see here, there is a cuff, which means that we cannot take this section in. So what we're going to do is we're going to move the seam back by 1 inch down here, and then we're going to split it 1/2 and 1/2 up here, like so. So 1 inch down here in an even run to 1/2 an inch at the top on the under sleeve, and then nothing on the top sleeve to 1/2 an inch at the very top of the top sleeve. So we're displacing that seam, so we get 1 inch out at the top, we get 1 inch out at the bottom overall, but we're not affected by the cuff. The second alteration we're going to do to the sleeve is to shorten it. Now the sleeve needs to be shortened by 3 1/4 inches, which is to there, which is exactly where the first buttonhole and button is placed. Now we're fortunate in this instance because the top 2 buttonholes are fake buttonholes, so we can simply unstitch them. Very often you'll have fake buttonholes, but sometimes you'll have real buttonholes. So in this case, the bottom 2 are real ones and the top 2 are fake ones. So we can shorten this to 3¼ inches, take out this first buttonhole and move all the buttons up and make it look as if nothing's ever happened to the sleeve. However, there might be cases where you have all real buttonholes and you're going to have to shorten it to within a close distance from one of those holes. In which case, what you would do is come down from the hole to which you are closest, leave as much of a gap as you can to turn it over, and then fold it on that line. So if it were the case that this buttonhole were real, what we would have done is probably lowered this line to here and folded it just below the first hole.
What would you do about the vent?
We can remake the vent if we want to, but it's a lot of work and
Yeah.
isn't necessary. I think the easiest thing to do is simply to fold it up.
Ventless.
Ventless. You don't necessarily need a cuff. Quick and effective, time saving.
And buttonholes?
No buttonholes.
No buttonholes, just buttons only.
Buttons only. You don't need them. You can put buttonholes if you want, but...
Yeah, well, that's an evil I don't deal with.
So we know approximately where our sleeve needs to be turned up to. So I'm going to get rid of this line because it's confusing. So our sleeve needs to be turned up to this top mark over here. So 3¼ inches from the bottom. So we're going to baste our linings down. So we're not going to go into the seam. We're going to baste it off the seam. A couple of inches in from here. We're simply going to baste it, again, 3 or 4 inches up from that line that we made across the sleeve. And also here, stay away a couple of inches from that hind arm seam. So we'll finish tacking it in place over here. Right, so once that's in place, we can start removing the buttons and the buttonholes. There, I'll unpick these buttonholes as well. Are your buttonholes good?
Obviously not. Do I give good buttonhole energy?
Yes.
Do I?
Yes.
Sorry to deceive.
My
My pearl stitches go on a nice little wavy walk around the buttonhole.
Oh, really?
Yeah, or they're like getting on top of each other.
Yeah, I mean, you have to do like 50 and then
Yeah.
fine.
Poppy says buttonholes are a state of mind. Just think a good buttonhole and then you'll find
one will come.
Yeah, and then one will come.
Nice. Okay, so that is done. So we've got our initial line here. We're going to leave 2 inches at the bottom. Doop, doop. So if you were shortening it only by 1 inch and needed to leave 2 inches at the bottom, you would undo this, which is probably what I should do, and then you'd cut it off. Let's do that. Put in place some good practice.
Good practice.
So we're undoing the cuff lining. We'll undo it all the way where it's attached at the cuff. Right, so it's completely free now. I'm going to undo the inlay at the base of the cuff. So we're letting out the very bottom. Lots of gubbins in there left over. I have now undone all of this and it's all spread out flat. And I've got my line here, which is 3¼ inches up from the base of the sleeve, which I've drawn in with the chalk. I'll leave 2 inches over here. Trace the line. Make sure everything's flat. And then simply chop it all off. Like that. Next step, just clean up that lining over here. is to undo the hind arm and to remark this line in properly on the other side. So flatten that out, bring that fold line further in so that I can mark it through all the way around. And so as to not lose it, I'm quickly going to run a baste in to the fold line of the cuff. So just catching the top layer of cloth and not catching the lining underneath, I'm just going to run that baste in, so we don't lose our marks. There. Next stage is to undo the hind arm all the way down. There. So all your linings are held in place in the right areas. We don't need to worry about them. So our next stage is to remark where we want our runs to come in. So here we have our undersleeve. We're going to press this flat, but I can see where things were sewn. Still, I'm not completely getting rid of my fold line. I'm just very briefly and quickly pressing it so I can control that inlay over there. And I'll do exactly the same on this side. On this side, there's no inlay. There's just that 3/8 of an inch seam allowance going all the way down. I'll quickly press that open. This I can press fully open because I know where this was sewn. Right, so we said we want to take it in 1/2 inch at the top to nothing at the bottom. So we mark 1/2 inch at the top over here, and we're nothing at the bottom over here on the top sleeve. So we come back into the raw edge and we're going to draw a line that slowly and gradually connects into the top of the sleeve like that. Once we've done that, we chop it off. There. We then come to our undersleeve, and on our undersleeve we said we wanted 1/2 inch off at the top and 1 inch off at the bottom. So on this side we're going to mark where the stitch lines are. So 1 inch in from the original stitch line at the bottom and 1/2 inch in from the original stitch line at the top. And the same thing, we're going to slowly draw a line that gradually connects into the top. So we know that the top sleeve was stitched 3/8 of an inch or 1 centimeter behind the raw edge. So we're going to lay this raw edge 1 centimeter beyond where the new stitch line that we want is. So we're going to make little marks here, 3/8 of an inch or 1 cm inside of that line. And we're going to match the white line here for the base of the cuff through to this side. So I'm quickly going to transfer the mark across. So this mark here I transfer to the other side. I lay that in so that my seam allowance is now sitting on the edge that I've just drawn, which means that when I stitch, I'll be stitching 1 cm off and I'll be hitting this stitch line and that stitch line beneath. and I'm lining up this white line with that white line. And as we go along, we're doing the same thing. Raw edge matched up to that new mark that we made 3/8 of an inch off the stitch line, so that both stitch lines on top sleeve and under sleeve line up, and just pin it going up all the way. Once you've done that, you're going to stitch with a back stitch or with a machine, so exactly 3/8 of an inch or 1 centimeter inside of that raw edge. So you're going to be stitching in on this new white line all the way up 3/8 of an inch inside of the raw edge. So we're going to do that now. So we've now stitched that in place, and you can see that stitch line 3/8 of an inch behind the raw edge. Something to note over here, your cuff might come up higher and you might not have this bit here which is folded all the way back. You might be folding your cuff higher up, or your cuff might be made slightly differently. In this case, we've got this little cutout here which is taking place. We're just stitching all the way down to the cutout, and obviously from there on it's all free because we can't sew that down and flip that over because of the holes and because it's already snipped. So we're just working with what we have. Make it up as you go along. Every jacket's going to look different and every alteration is going to yield its own set of problems. So just work out how you go about resolving those. So we can now undo these and then press this seam open. So I'm going to use a sleeve board, but you would probably have to insert something in here. So you can stuff a t-shirt and press this open, but we've got specialist boards for this. A little bit of water, and press it open all the way. Right, so once that's pressed one way, flip it inside out. So pop your hand inside the sleeve and then turn it inside out. And there you have your narrowed sleeve. And we're going to press that seam again from the outside. There we go. That's pressed open. The last thing we need to do is turn in the bottom of the cuff. So we're simply going to fold this in, but we're folding it in only at the cloth. So we're going to grab the lining, which you can see there, and I'm going to pull the lining inside and out of the way. And then I'm going to fold the cuff in like on the trouser hem. So lining's out of the way and I'm only catching the cloth onto itself. Can be a little tricky to keep the lining away. Right, with that done, so now that we've done that, we're going to pull the linings down from the sleeve. Just give them a slight tug, like that, but all the base are keeping the linings in place. And we're going to trim the linings back to the same level, or just about, as the sleeve cuff itself. Don't cut the cuff, just cut the linings to just 3/8 or ½ inch below the cuff itself. Then invert the sleeve, and you're now going to hem stitch it in place just like the hem of your trouser. So catching one small thread of the sleeve and then catching the cuff inlay. Quick word of warning. Sometimes the inlay can get what's called tight, which is where you get some ruching on the underlayer of where the inlay is lying because they are fighting against one another. This happens when the inlay is shorter than the cloth that lies on top. In order to combat this issue, you can split the seams where the inlay lies in order to gain more length in the inlay and splay it to prevent there being any disturbances on the top cloth that lays behind. So that's the example here on the forearm of the sleeve where we split the seam in order to get the inlay to lay flat. The same has been done on the hind arm over there. When you get to the seam allowance of the forearm, you can back tack once to secure it in place and then just keep going. Once that's secured in place, you can fell down these sections here. And then simply tack off. Now, grab a ruler and lay this 1 inch below the top of the cuff and draw a line. And continue that line all the way through the circumference of the cuff. Then grab your lining, fold it back over that line. Your bastes are keeping the lining at the right height, and simply baste this down where it lies. Now you'll have to ruche this in because we've taken in the cuff but haven't taken in the cuff lining, and that's okay. We've just saved ourselves some time. Ruching in the lining should not show to the other side. So you should see what I mean in a second. But there'll be a slight excess of lining compared to cloth.
Are you matching your side seams?
Yeah, so you would usually match your side seams in. So your hind arm and your forearm matched across on top of one another. It doesn't matter if they don't lay exactly on top of one another, but they should lay close to one another. But hopefully your base will prevent them from shifting in any case. Last one. There. Now you can see how the lining is a little wavy, but that's fine. Now that's your sleeve lined. 2 last steps. One is to fell the lining down, and the last step will be to press everything in place and then remove those basting stitches, and then sew our buttons back on.
I'm really bad at sewing on buttons.
Why?
I just knot the thread, man. So I have to chop it all off and do it again.
So you're only catching the inlay, right? You're not catching the...
Oh, no, it's not going all the way through.
Yep.
Okay.
So once that's felled, your final stage is to press everything flat. And then remove all of your bastes. Don't remove the base at the top, only the ones that are securing the lining in place at the base of the sleeve. So once that's done, we'll press it from the other side. Again, you can do this flat against a board. It's easier to do it against a sleeve board, which is why we're using one. And then once it's flat, make sure that it's sitting flat like that. And we're simply going to press a fold into the cuff at the very bottom over here. So right on the seam, just press that flat so it falls straight as it's worn. Only a couple of inches up, like so. I'm just going to finally put another little light press on the inside. Final step is to pop your buttons back on. So we're going to mark them in place. The first button starts 1.25 inches up from the bottom of the cuff. Mark that through. And all subsequent buttons are sitting 1/2 inch apart from one another. So we can trace these little lines in. We then want the buttons to sit 1/2 inch inside of our hind arm seam. So connect those lines in. and we're going to sew a button at each intersection. So to sew your buttons on, you're going to double thread, put a knot in, and start by coming in all the way and then back out at that same point. You then grab the button and loop it in like that, and then pop your needle back in at that intersection and pull the button into place. You then come in on one of the holes that hasn't been threaded yet, go back in on the opposing hole, and then come back through above that intersection. And keep doing this, going from one set of holes to the other set of holes 3 or 4 times. That's 2, that's 3. Once you've done that, you then grab your thread, twirl it around about 8 times, and then grab your needle and run it through the stem of the button that you've just made. Run it through a second time, and then at the third time, create a knot. So loop the thread in front of the needle, pull that through, and then one last time, go through your stem, and then cut your thread. And that's your button sewn in. So repeat that for all the other buttons. So there you have your sleeve almost complete. The last thing we need to do is to make sure that this run at the top here is corrected. So as you'll see, when we took in the sleeve at the top, we created this step. So you can see how the sleeve comes in, and then there's this gap here, and then it continues up. We need to correct these into one another. So what we're going to do is lay the sleeve flat on these varying sections, and so you can see how that needs to line back in with the top of the sleeve up here. So we're going to press the seam allowances over here flat again. We now lay our sleeve flat again, and you can see how the very top of the sleeve here at the apex, so what we call the crown, needs to line back in to this line over there where the seam is raw on the undersleeve. So in order for us to do that, we keep the sleeve exactly where it is at its very height, and we run it down gradually in a smooth manner to that run over there. Now you need to make sure that this is a nice smooth run, like that, coming all the way down. Once you've drawn it, you chop it off. So make sure that you do this as precisely as you can, and make sure you don't cut off the lining. And there you have it. That is your sleeve, ready to be sewn back in.
Love ya.
Now we're on to, should we do 4 parts first? That would be the long bit. Let's do the long bit first.
Well, we've got the energy.
Well, we have we're the energy crew.
Energy, come on, girls.
Energy crew. From our handy notes, which I've torn out of our little carnet now. Shorten coat by 3 3/4 of 1 inch. So let's do that. We have our 4-part here, where we've indicated by how much we're going to take in the quarters. So this section there, so that we've got our little opening. And then we have no side vents, we have a center vent. So the vent in the coat, which is that thing there, which allows for a little bit more room around your tush,
So you can walk and sit.
Walk and sit,
stuff.
yeah. We love to sit.
I know.
Sometimes they're here at the side seams. Other times they're here at the centre back. This one's at the centre back. The same principles apply whether they're at the side seams or the centre back. The only difference being it's slightly easier if they're at the centre back, because you only got one centre back vent to contend with rather than two. Fear not if your coat has side vents, because it's exactly the same. You've just got to do it twice. We're going to start off by taking off this button. This coat came without a first button. You can see where it was attached once upon a time. So we're going to buy a button to replace it. Wow, it does not want to come out. Ooh.
Bye. Bye, babe.
She was braced. Keep her safely away. So we're going to take away the little bits of thread that were holding the buttons in place. Are you enjoying the sun, Phoebe?
I really wish I could.
Why not?
It's hay fever, man.
Oh, yeah.
It's just so bad. I've been mouth breathing for the past, like, a week and a half.
I couldn't think of anything worse.
And then, I'll say 2 days ago, got my nose back.
So, first step is to measure up from the bottom of the coat, 3 3/4 all along. That is something to bear in mind when you're shortening your jacket, is that the shorter you go, the closer to the bottom of the jacket your pocket is. And sometimes it's better to keep this distance than it is to keep making this short, right? Otherwise it looks quite funky.
Yeah, you don't want like a pocket flap hanging over your jacket.
So here we are 6.5 inches from the bottom. I think that's pretty much as low as you want to go, really. I'm always in favour of a long jacket in any case. I think it does quite the opposite. I think it lengthens people, doesn't shorten them. If everything else is in proportion, you've narrowed your shoulders, your side seams aren't too big, your sleeves are the right length, then having a long jacket, I think, elongates you and makes you look taller rather than shorter.
Agreed.
Agreed?
Agreed, sis.
Agreed, sis. 3 3/4 is there. So we make little marks all along the way. That quick press. And then we want to open the quarter as we wrote here. So to that mark, we made the note that it's 3/4 of an inch opened, 5 inches down from the second button over here. So we measure 5 inches down from the second button there, and we want to open it 3/4 of an inch at this point. So at this point, we need to meet there. So now what we need to do is graduate this curve and translate this to up here, and then connect all those lines in. One way to do it is to grab a bit of paper, pop it under here, and then draw this shape across, and then cut it out of the paper, and then you use that as a shaper for this. We could do that. Or if you've got a curve rule, which you're unlikely to have, you would simply use one of these. If you're thinking of investing into sewing equipment, you can use that and shape that through like that and use the curve on there. But we're going to assume that you don't have one, so we're going to go by the OG method. Now let's find a bit of paper. So we've got ourselves here a little bit of craft paper. Press that down a bit, unscrunch it. There we go. Pen over here. We're simply going to apply a bit of weight to the jacket, get it to lay flat, and then run our pen along the edge of the coat.
Careful if the coat's like beige or something.
Oh yeah, obviously don't get the pen
on the coat. Something I would do.
We're quickly going to mark this as the front, and this is the bottom, and then we're going to cut that out. Right, cut this bit out square. Now we have our templates. Doom, doom, doom. So here we have our template. And now we're going to make the template sit into the first button up here, which we can mark in. And then we need it to hit that 3/4 mark that we made. It doesn't matter if it hits it perfectly, it just needs to make sure that it clears it. And then line that up with the first bottom mark you can see there. So try and get that to slot in place like that as best you can. And then draw that across. There. So we've got our curve in place. And now we're going to, with a ruler, connect all the marks along the bottom. Now, the easiest thing to do to mark it across to the other side is to grab the coat and flip the other forepart on top. So right sides to right sides. Make sure that the coats are laying nicely on top of one another. All the way along. Edges are perfectly on each other. And then simply bang the chalk marks through. And you should get an outline transferred over to the other side, which you can then simply draw on. Like that. We can then run a base stitch to mark the edge so that we don't lose it. And here you only want to catch the very top of the cloth. You don't want to go through to any other layers beneath. You only want to catch the very top.
This thread is giving me a hard time.
Oh yeah?
Oh yeah, there we go. Got her.
You show her.
Show her who's boss.
So as you're going in, you're flicking your needle out of the way of the canvas. That's the inside of the coat that sits just beneath the top cloth. And you're only catching that top layer. Great. So now that you've done that, you can then chop the bottom of the jacket off. This is a scary bit. So measure down 1.5 inches. Extend that line straight across. And chop it. It feels so wrong, doesn't it?
Yeah. Trimming things back always scare me.
Right, so this is undone. So we can easily do this bottom of the jacket back up, but this front edge over here is still attached, and it's attached twice. It's attached with the edge stitching, which is this little prick stitch that sits on the top of the coat, and it's attached within the seam itself as well. So we have to do all of those, undo all of those stitches up to that tack over there that we made. So we're just going in and we're undoing everything. So we're going to go up to that point and then stop. Okay, So now we can see the inside of the jacket and how that's been finished with a tape. We're going to ignore the construction, and all we're going to do is very quickly press this and this flat. So press that out. Take away all of the little threads that were left in.
If this was a production jacket, would it just be fusing in there?
Well, do you want to explain what a production jacket is?
Well, this is a bespoke jacket, so you'll find things like canvas and edge tape and things like that, just so you know the jacket drapes better. But that comes a lot of like handcraft and things like that. So usually in a production jacket, it's made faster. So instead of like having to canvas up and hand stitch in the edge tape, you would just fuse it, right?
Yeah, and then you might have a fused canvas as well.
Yeah.
So this bit of cloth here would be stuck to the front of the jacket, wouldn't it?
Yeah.
So I think the easiest way to go about this alteration is to ignore the edge tape, which is this element here. And I think we're going to cut straight through it basically, so that things aren't so complicated. And it might make the jacket slightly bulkier in that area, but I think it won't show that much. Again, we're cutting loads of corners. In theory, the corners that we're cutting won't negatively impact the overall look and results. Great. So now that we've got this unraveled, you can see that between here and here, the distance between our white line and the edge of the cloth is 3/8 of an inch. And we want to maintain that 3/8 of an inch, that typical seam allowance, coming down the front edge up to a point about here. So we're going to draw a construction line, which is more or less coming straight down at the angle of that front edge. And we're going to measure in about 2.5 inches from there and find the intersection between that and the bottom of the coat. It's at this point here that we're going to stop leaving the 3/8 seam allowance, and we're going to leave the 1.5 inch inlay. So from this point onwards, we only want to leave 3/8 of an inch, all the way up to that point there where that seam allowance heads back into the coat because we haven't undone it. There, and then cut straight up into that point, like that. So now we have something that looks like this, and we're going to make sure, as Phoebe noted, that the pocket bag is sitting above this white line. Unpick the canvas a little bit more, and we can see where the white line is in place. It's over here and over here, and we want to sit about 1 inch above it. Yeah, so we're going to mark 1 inch there and there. So you can see the stitch line here, the original stitch line of the pocket, and it's coming all the way down into the base of the jacket over here and then heading back up. We're going to start at this line, and we're going to stitch that line across this mark and then back up. And we're going to do it with a back stitch. So we just want to round off the edges. So you can see where the original stitch is. We're going to round off into that line and then round off out of that line back into the original stitch on the other side, like that. So tack in. know how the suit that we have today is derived from South Asian garments?
I didn't know that.
So the justacle is a French court interpretation in the 18th century or late 17th of a garment from the Asian subcontinent. And I like how it jumped. So we went from doublet, right? And then we suddenly went to justacle, which like are completely unrelated in terms of like silhouette. And then we adopted this sort of Eastern garb and then derived it into what we now see as a lounge suit. And then that's permeated all of this Eastern wear and tweaked that. And so it's almost like a bit of a full circle kind of thing where it's come to us and then it's gone back through colonialism to
That's so interesting.
former colonies. Right, so we shorten the pocket. We're above the bottom of the coat now. Doop. You can see that
Hello.
over there. So now we are going to just above this white line in this area. Mark through where that white line is. There and there. And I'm going to cut it to 1/8 above that line. So trace a line there. Don't cut the underlayer over here. Pop your scissors on top, cut straight up, and then cut 1/8 of an inch above where the bottom of the coat is sitting.
In a production coat, would it be the same? Could you cut using canvas?
It depends on how it's canvas. You probably wouldn't have to. It might look different. So that's a good point. So if the canvas is stuck to the forepart, then you don't need to worry about that. You can just turn it up. So you don't need to cut anything away. Thank you for mentioning.
You're welcome.
Right. Flip the coat this side up and then grab the seam allowance and baste it down like this. So we're just going to quickly press that in.
Is this one of the parts where you have to be like decently accurate so you don't change the shape of the quarter?
Yes. So we're following the white line and folding the jacket over on top of that line.
Did I tell you I rode Honey's bicycle around Victoria Park the other day?
Oh, cute.
And I was like, yay.
Pootling. Were you enjoying it?
And it's like a child's bike as well, so I was like too close to the floor
Nice.
and a basket at the front.
You can see here where the canvas sits just above the marks that we're going to fold the jacket over to. So we'll just do that quickly and baste them in. Poof. Right. So at this section here, we're going to undo the felling. So this is where the vent is. So this is the under vent on the right side of the jacket. So we're going to undo this a couple of inches up. There. And continue basting it down. Like that. And we make it fold over and wrap up the top. Like that. Now we press that all into place. We then grab some thread and we're going to tack with a little pad stitch the seam allowance to the canvas without catching the top cloth beneath. So I'm only catching the canvas over here. You'll have to catch just a little bit of that canvas if it's fused in place, and you're just catching the seam allowance there, and you're pad stitching it down into place. Your needle, as it's going through, is not coming through all the way to the other side. That's not my needle, that's a white stitch. It's only catching the canvas here, which is that middle piece of fabric, and it's keeping this seam allowance here flat against the body of the jacket. Right, so this section as well, I'm just padding that to the canvas only. Again, my needle isn't coming through to the other side. And then I'm just maintaining that pad stitch all the way until I reach the pocket bag here where I can no longer pad it onto the canvas. And then I back tack. There. Right, so now we're going to hem stitch the inlay to the bottom of the jacket all along here. So just like on the cuff, coming into here, we can continue along, just catching the canvas. But then once we're past the canvas, we need to remember to only take a tiny little thread at the bottom of the coat. So here we are. Tiny little thread that I catch on the surface cloth, and I don't pull tight. Tiny thread. At the top, and then fell it down on this edge. With that done, and the pocket sitting outside here, we're going to turn over the facing. So we're going to come through here, and we're going to baste the facing down and have it sit ever so slightly further back than the edge that we folded initially. So you want 1/8 of an inch approximately between the original edge that we folded and the new edge that we're folding on top, because you don't want that seam to be visible from the other side. And once I'm happy with its position, you begin tacking it. Again, just fold it a little bit further back and tack it into place. Right, so we reach the end of our facing. Make sure that the lining is going on the other side of the pocket bag. There. And baste this down a little bit further up from the bottom of the coat. About 1/4 of an inch will do. As you come in, you're going to lift it up from this point a little bit higher and leave at least 1/4 of an inch from the bottom of the coat. The second thing we're going to do as well is we're going to, rather than baste it right on the edge, we're going to baste it about 1 inch further up from the edge. There. So 1 inch further up from the edge basted, and the lining is sitting 1/4 to 3/8 above the bottom of the jacket. Now as you get to the other corner, over here you can come down and just tack that little corner into place, and then come back up the edge and tack the lining down. There. Now I'm going to press this. Make sure you don't wet your linings or you're going to stain them. You just need to press the linings dry, but you can wet the facing.
But I learnt that the hard way. The iron spat on my skirt lining.
Oh no.
So I had to do what any tailor had to do, dunk it in water.
Oh, you dunked it?
I just dunked it in water so it was all water stained.
Oh man.
It worked though.
Tough. Yeah, it does work. There we go. And here you can start to see that our jacket is shortened. Ooh la la.
Yeah.
Not so hard. Definitely doable.
Yeah, definitely.
Right, last step. We're going to fell the facing down. So from the point at which it is no longer secured, so over here you can see that it's still shut. We're going to dig our needle in and start felling it down. So just discreetly stitching it into place, closing that seam up. So it fell up to the point where you then began that inch gap. back tack at this point there, and then lift that up, and what you want to do is slip stitch. So you want to catch the top of the inlay and you want to catch the very edge of the lining as you're going through. I'm catching just the inlay. I've pushed the lining out of the way and I've catched the underside of that lining only right on the edge. And what that means is that you're going to have an extra little bit of lining here that can ride up to prevent the linings from looking tight. So if the linings are tight, it can create a little problem. This is a bit of a safety mechanism that's included in jacket construction. So I'll do that one more time. My needle goes into the top cloth here, only on the inlay. It doesn't come through to the other side. And then I pull my lining back, but I split it half and half like this. So with my needle, I can only catch the bottom layer of the lining here. You can see where the fold is. And then I pull through. And I do that all along the bottom of the jacket. And once I've reached the edge over here, I then come back down, fell, and fell up the lining to where it is still attached. And that's it, the bottom of your coat done. You can then remove all of those bases. There'll be one last step, which will be to edge stitch the facing into place. Now, to do that, we start where the facing stops. So you can see over here is where my facing ends. I put my needle in and I come to the edge of my cloth, single thread, like that. Did we explain it in the first videos? We did. Well, I'm going to repeat it just for your benefit. You come back ever so slightly from where you came out with your needle, go back in and come back out a short distance away, about 1/4 of an inch, and you don't pull tight. And you're going through all layers. So you're catching the folded top cloth layer and the folded facing layer. And you're going back in just behind where you came out, coming back forwards 1/4 of an inch and taking your needle out and not pulling. And you're doing that about 1/8 of an inch away from the edge. And you keep doing that all the way along up until you get to the point where the edge stitching, you can see the little pricks all along here, begins again. So you're just completing that run back in, just to stop this seam from rolling back. And that's the bottom of your coat done.
Yay!
Yay! So the bottom of the coat is now done, and we have one alteration left, which is to take in the underarm cut. Ooh, point I wanted to make, which I didn't make. So we altered the underarm cut on this coat, but that isn't the most typical alteration to do to the waist of a jacket. The most typical one is to do it through the side seam. And well, we didn't have to touch it, but the principle is exactly the same between this and between that. You simply displace the seam out. So you've got a bit of inlay there, just like on our trousers, on the side seam usually. Sometimes you do, sometimes you don't. And you literally just move it back and forth, take it in or let it out. Or you can take it in on the double, like we did here. So yeah, just fake it till you make it, wing it, and it usually works out just fine. So on our notes, we've written that we need to take it in 1/2 inch on the double at the top to 0 at the pocket height. Now obviously we can't come all the way down into that point because we're not going to be able to access it because of the pocket. So we're going to end our alteration 1 inch or so up from that pocket point so that we can still get our hand in there and finish off those stitches. And so first things first, we're going to mark the alteration in, and for that we need to gain access to the seam. So we're going to have to open the side seam lining up. This little tack over here, I'm just going to undo it and lift it back a couple of stitches and re-pop it into place down here. So don't undo it completely, just free it from the side seam. there. Like that, we have access between here and there. That's our side seam here. And then stitch down the lining across the side seam all the way down to fix it into place. Lay the jacket flat. Try and get it as flat as possible. There. And then from that tack that we've just remade, fix the linings up against the cloth, exactly where they lie, and do so all the way down the coat, staying a couple of inches away from the side seam over there. Lol.
Thimble down.
She gone forever.
I've got 7 more of her.
Right, so that's done. We can now do the same thing from the other side, and we're going to tack the linings down here. And this just helps us out when we go to put the linings back together. Again, remember, we're altering the underarm cut, so the seam that sits behind this one. So we're going to come a couple inches away from it and just secure the linings down away from where we're doing our alteration, so that we still have access to that location. Great. Now we're ready to undo the linings on the side seam.
If you had to do a final collection, what would yours be about?
What would mine be about?
Or at least aesthetic-wise, what would it look like?
I have a thing for futuristic reinterpretations of 40s garments. Very
specific.
Yeah, I love Adrian Greenberg.
Instead of bullet bras, you get bullet bums.
Yeah, why not? But you know how like that whole Mugler, Claude Montana thing
Yeah.
is a reinterpretation of 40s piece.
Yeah.
Like all of Elia's work is reinterpretation of, to some extent, Adrian Greenberg's work. There's so many of those designers. Anyway, I'm a predictable one when it comes to that. I just love his work. So I would do that. Yeah.
Me too. I'm obsessed.
Blade Runner is Adrian Greenberg, basically.
Slay.
Charles Node, Wimbledon alumni, watch out, who designed it.
I've not seen Blade Runner.
Some of the best costume ever produced.
Okay.
Yeah, the OG version, not the
Not the one with Ryan Gosling.
not the one with Ryan Gosling.
Not 2049.
Not to criticise Ryan Gosling, but OG Blade Runner is where it's at. Right, so we have the underarm cut here, and we're going to reverse it. There, get everything out the way, and press it flat. Now you can see the pocket starting there. So we're literally going to trace our alteration in once we flatten the seam and stop it shy of that pocket. Right, so 1/2 inch on the double at the top, and then we're only going to be able to sew this into about that point there. And what we're going to do is just trace a slow run that comes in to the original stitch line, like that. And we're going to take that in.
Easy peasy.
So back stitch that in place, all the way down.
Bloop, bloop, bloop.
How fun. Right, so I've now stitched this in place. So I'm going to cut this back to a seam allowance, so 3/8 of an inch all along my stitch line. There, so I'm going to trim that off. And then I'm going to undo the original stitch up until the point where it meets the new one. Right, is to press that seam open. Once you've pressed it on one side, just make sure that it's looking flat on the other before you proceed. And it is, that's great. So then flip it back over. And this is a slightly dangerous part, fairly simple. You want to make sure that the cloth is stretched out properly, but that the lining is loose. So when you put this back together, the lining is loosey-goosey, but the cloth itself is nice and tight. If the lining is tight and you pull this too much, then it's going to crease on the other side when you wear it, and it's going to be unsightly. So make sure that when you're lying it down, you're making sure that it's nice and stretched out everywhere on the cloth. And then you simply lay the lining gently back over, like that. And safe thing to do is to baste it back in where it was initially sewn, and then you know you're not going to encounter any problems.
So is the lining part just kind of has to be slightly bigger than the shell, but not, so you'd have to take the lining in then?
So you, in theory, you should be taking the lining in. If you're letting it out, you need to let the lining out as well. But we're going to do something slightly different. When I'm basting this down, so I'm starting right at the top here, where they were initially connected, I am only catching the lining itself. My needle isn't going through to the cloth, yeah? So I'm going in all the way, and then I'm lifting my needle out from the cloth and basting it down. So needle goes in, comes out from the cloth, and then only tacks the back lining to the side body lining. And again, I'm basically pasting the lining back to where it was initially sewn to make sure that it's not tight. And that's why we put these stitches in here, to mitigate the risk of you getting that wrong. Now, because we've taken in the cloth at the top of the armhole, our lining is going to be particularly loose in this area. So what we're going to do is spread the armhole out like that and press the lining down. And then we're going to flip it, make sure the lining is sitting flat over here. We're going to baste down the side seam at this location, just across the top here. Make sure that everything is flat, and then tack. And then we're going to do the same thing here. So we're going to pull the lining in, make sure that everything's flat, and we're just going to tack. Again, flatten everything. Make sure inside is flat. We're just going to tack the very top of the side body in place over here. Going through all the layers on the underarm cut. And we then flip it over one more time, and that little excess that we took it in by is now visible by virtue of this little flippy thing over here. Everything is secured between these two locations, so we know how much is in excess. So then all we do is push this forwards, make a little pleat like that, make sure nothing's tight, and then just press it down into the lining. And the last thing to do is to baste that pleat along the armhole. Run a pad stitch from the forepart down, securing the pleat there. I can even back tack on top of the pleat, and then across the armhole, and this time I'm still catching the cloth up to the base that I made to secure it at the side seam. And there you have it. That is your underarm cut altered.
Woo!
Woo. You would now just have to remove all these extra little threads that are left in at the side seam lining and fell down the side seam lining all the way. Make sure that when you're felling it, you're not catching the cloth underneath, you're just felling lining to lining. I'll quickly do that. Bonjour.
Hello.
So we're back with our sleeve. So first step, we're going to tidy up all the little threads that are left over in here. So you're just undoing everything and tidying things up. So once that's done, we're going to secure the armhole in place. But right before we do that, we just need to make the alteration to the shoulder width. So going back to our notes, we have taken the back shoulder by a 1/2 inch. So the distance between the centre back seam over here and the shoulder end needs to be a 1/2 inch smaller. Now I can see where I was initially sewn in, so there's only 3/8 seam allowance left to the raw edge, and I want to reduce this by a 1/2 inch. Grab a little ruler. From the raw edge, I'm going to mark where the new raw edge needs to be. Right, so we need to come into there. Now, the aim of the game is to find a nice even run up to that point from the base of the sleeve and then back down. So if we turn our jacket this way, we're going to stay the same at the front over here, and we're going to slowly curve into this point here. So we're just going to put little marks in and find a nice even run that curves as naturally as possible, and then come back down the other side. Make sure that your run is smooth and it should connect back in to this raw edge point over here very gradually. Now this will be subject to change because we've made an alteration to the width of the jacket. Right, first things first is we're going to mark these runs in. So we're only going to grab the cloth, we're not going to grab any canvas. If you're fused though, if your canvas is fused, that is to say stuck to the cloth, then obviously you're going to have to get the canvas. But you don't want to be catching the pad, the shoulder pad at this point. And because you've taken out the stitches that are holding this jacket in place, it's likely that your shoulder pad and your lining are all loose. So you grab just your cloth for now, and you come in here and you create this little stitch running backwards. So this is called a chain stitch, and it's just to mark the run that we're going to follow. So as we come down here, back tack, and then we're going to start inserting our sleeve into the armhole. Now, you'll remember that we made that alteration on the underarm cut and we took it in by a 1/2 inch on the double. That's a big alteration to the armhole because it's made the armhole a whole inch smaller. The sleeve circumference and the armhole circumference have to be related to one another, and the armhole has to be ever so slightly smaller than the sleeve. And the reason for that is that the top of the sleeve over here needs what's called fullness. So as you're inserting the sleeve into the top across this section here, we ease and ruche the sleeve in to give it a bit of a puff to get over your deltoid muscle. This prevents the sleeve from being tight in that top section as it runs past the curve of the shoulder. But we've thrown this out now because we've taken in the underarm by 1 inch. Now typically what you would do is take in the sleeve by the same amount that you took in the underarm cut. And that is what we've done here. When we narrowed our sleeve, we took it in a 1/2 inch on the double all the way down, and we took in a 1/2 inch on the double over here at our underarm cut, which means that our sleeve and our armhole are perfectly in sync with one another. The sleeve is still ever so slightly bigger than the armhole needs to be because we've taken in the armhole by the same amount by which we've taken in the sleeve. If you haven't done that, then it's wise to either do that same thing. So you take in your sleeve by the same amount you've taken in your armhole. That is to say whether you've taken it in at the side seam or on the side body. Or what you can do is fudge it a little bit, ease it in a little bit more around here and kick the sleeve back further and grow the size of the armhole. Now, I don't recommend doing this because it is a bit tricky to do, and the easiest thing is just to take in the sleeve. But if you want to fudge it, you can do it. It is possible. And it would just be a case of you playing about with the insertion of the sleeve in this location to get it to fit slightly wider set out so that you're eating up more length and are not having to like ease it in massively across the top of the crown. Remember, we made that pitch mark over here, which corresponds to where this seam in the sleeve matches up to the armhole. So we place that forearm seam here against that pitch mark. We grab just the cloth and we begin basting the sleeve in 3/8 of an inch off the raw edge. As you can see here, I've got the pitch and the forearm seam marrying up. I place raw edge to raw edge and I start basting it 3/8 of an inch off. And you go all the way around and catch only your cloth and canvas if you're fused, and not canvas if you're not. As I'm coming up through this part of the sleeve here, I'm now marrying up the raw edge of my sleeve against that chain stitch that I made. And I'm sewing 3/8 of an inch off. And as I'm coming into here, I'm starting to create a little bit of ease in the sleeve. So if you look over here, rather than putting both bits of cloth flat against each other, I'm creating a little bit, I'm pushing the sleeve ever so slightly in against the armhole, and I'm filling it in very slowly and slightly so that that excess which is present in the sleeve from this point upwards slowly increases up to the top. Now you'll have a little bit of inlay here left over from the sleeve, so we're just going to come behind it and then come back through the other side, and then make sure that it's lined up a little bit further along and carry on along 3/8 behind the raw edge. Now as you get to this point, it starts to become impossible to continue sewing it from this side, so we're just going to put our needle in, invert our coat, so we're working from the inside now, and here we have better access to the sleeve. So we continue with our little bits of fullness coming along, tiny little amounts, and you can see them there.
Are you putting the same amounts of ease throughout the entire top bit of the coat?
Yeah, so we said no ease at the base of the armhole at the bottom, and then slowly as you come to the back of the armhole it starts going a little bit more, and then the maximal amount that you're putting in is right at the top of the armhole. So where you can see where the shoulder seam is there, that's the top of our armhole, that's where we put the most amount of ease in, and then we start reducing it again as we get to the front of the armhole. So I've got past the top here, so I'm going to reduce it slowly. and then we come back in to the base of the armhole. Now in theory, if you've done your job right, there should be no fullness left over. Sometimes you come back into the original stitch and you'll find that you've got loads more cloth to fill in. If that happens, you've got to undo your sleeve, try and push more fullness in, and then go back down slowly and redistribute it. It's not an exact science, it can be quite tricky to do. So now we're checking it.
Yum.
So what we're doing now is we're looking at the sleeve as we've inserted it. Basted it in, and you can see how the little bits of fullness in here are visible through the crown as well and through the base. And we're just checking that it's not excessive and that everything's looking just about right. Now to my eye, it looks like there's a little bit of fullness here, which is visible and could go at the back here instead. So I'm just going to tilt the sleeve back ever so slightly more, and all these bubbles over here of fullness, I'm going to try and push them a little bit further back. So start easing earlier on so that when I come to the front of the sleeve here, it's just looking a little bit cleaner in the front. Yeah, but it's normal to go in, try it, see how it goes, fail, and then try again.
It's hard to get these things right the first time.
Yeah, sleeves are a nightmare.
Yeah, it's one of the more challenging things.
So take your time. They don't need to be absolutely perfect, but you can get them looking fairly decent after a few tries. So as I said, what I need to do is start increasing the amount of fullness in the back section here a little bit sooner, so that in the front section over here, there isn't quite so much. So this is where you shouldn't be scared of undoing your work. Literally, take that out. Coming back to back of the arm over here. And then from this point, pushing a little bit more fullness into the sleeve. So my little bubbles of fullness over here are going to be slightly more increased as compared to how they were at the start.
I remember when I made my check jacket, it took me 4 hours to ease in one sleeve.
Yeah. I mean, yeah. You get the knack of it, but it's normal to spend a lot of time on this area, right?
Yeah.
So don't be frustrated if it's taking you a while. It's perfectly normal.
It's normal. Yeah. But I feel like I feel like I'm like 3 sleeves away from like getting used to it. I can feel it.
I'm excited for you. Right. Now we're going to have another look. And that's looking a lot better. So we've got a little bit more fullness around the back here, which I'm happy about. And we've got less around the front over here. And the sleeve is draping nicely. By draping nicely, we mean it's falling flush without any kinks. Now, I wouldn't worry about any kinks forming in your sleeves too much. They might not fall as nicely as you'd like to because it's very difficult to get the run in the sleeve to match the run in the armhole. But the point that we'd like to make sure that you get is that so long as your sleeve is looking neat enough to be worn, then that's good enough. There are some things that are correct and are not, which I think would be a bit too much to go over.
Yeah.
But just try and get them looking neat and try the jacket on.
Yeah, it's definitely try the jacket on because, you know, your pitch could be like in different places. But this looks about right.
In theory, so the pitch that Phoebe was referring to was the angle of the sleeve in the jacket. The sleeve can be angled like this or angled like that or angled like that in the jacket, and that can have a big effect on the fit. So what you want to make sure, as Phoebe was saying, is that where your arm lies against the jacket and where the sleeve lies against the jacket should be at the same angle. If you find that there's loads of like gathering like this in the sleeve, it's likely that you need to rotate the sleeve inside of the armhole a little bit and tweak it to get it to fit right. But in theory, if you've marked that pitch over here and the pitch in the coat was good from the start, then you shouldn't have too many problems. What other things could we encounter? Probably worth mentioning.
I think just the pitch and the ease are the things that I struggle with personally, because I always just like put too much to the front and I'm like, oh. But yeah, I think it's just like the ease is probably gonna like catch you out a little bit, because you don't know where the front of the jacket is in terms of the armhole. But if you just like look where you're going and turn things inside out and things like that, it should be fine. It's half science, half a feeling.
Right, so once you're satisfied with that, then what you need to do is pop a second basting stitch in, and the fullness that you've distributed inside of the sleeve, you can perfect its location a little bit more accurately with this second basting stitch. As I'm coming in, I'm going in between the stitches that I've made with the same running stitch, and I'm just making sure that the ease that I inserted is inserted and distributed in a nice and even manner. I can just tweak the way in which I've distributed it a little bit more accurately with the second stitch. So I noticed there that there was a big bubble and no bubble next to it, so I just shifted that across a little bit. And there you have it. That's your sleeve basted in. Next step is to press the fullness in. So all of those bubbles of fullness that we've created need to be shrunk. So the wonderful thing about suit cloth, particularly wool, is that it can shrink under heat. I'm going to grab an iron and we're going to flatten the jacket in small sections and just make sure, adding a little bit of water at times, that the fullness is fully shrunk in. So you can see this over here. You can see in this area here the bubbles of fullness. I'm going to grab a little bit of water, just wet that section a little bit, and with my iron just shrink all of that in place.
What would you do if it was like cotton, just out of curiosity, or velvet, one of the hard ones?
You can't put as much fullness in, can you? So maybe taking the sleeve a bit more at the top to reduce the amount of fullness in there. Or as I said, fudge your armhole, run a little bit and make it a bit wider to get the sleeve to go in. What would you do?
I'm not sure. It's just like I was wondering, because my flatmate made a velvet suit last project, and it was like she wanted to go for like really strong shoulders, but then she realised she couldn't like shrink things in. Yeah. So there were loads of like little pleats at the top.
Yeah. You can't do it. Some people get very good at shrinking things in. I'm not. I don't do very big sleeves, but yeah, there's a knack to doing it.
It's just one of those things to do like 50 of to get super good at.
Exactly.
It's like a buttonhole.
Exactly. Right. Just keep going along in small sections, getting rid of that fullness. It's important that you take your time on this job, because you won't have another opportunity to shrink this in. So if you do it well now, things will look good. If you don't do it well now, things will look slightly less good for the entire life of your jacket.
The only time I ever run is like back from the pub. If it's a local, I'm like, in my drunk mind, I'm like, I can do it. 10-minute walk, 2-minute run.
And you run home
and I just
drunk?
I just run home drunk.
That's a good idea.
I didn't realise shrinking is like such a long process.
Yeah.
I always forget to do this part.
Take your time.
And then I'm like, oh,
Oh, I fucked up.
I was like, oh, well, looks like I have to do it from the outside then.
No, you can't do it. Right. Great. So now we're going to stitch the sleeve in. All we do is back stitch it in place twice. Reason why we do it twice is because this is subject to a lot of stress and strain. Right behind the baste, coming in, and just back stitching it all the way along. That is it. And you're just catching the cloth or the cloth on the canvas if it's fused. That's it. And you do this twice all the way around the sleeve.
Would you machine it twice?
No, machine it once, back stitch it by hand twice.
I had a dream that we were filming one of these,
Yeah.
but we were on the tube. So it was just me like holding the camera like this, and you were just like back stitching like a sleeve in or something.
It does sound more organised than the ways in which we have been going about doing this.
Just like not pressing record. At least I was holding
At
it.
least you're holding the cam. So first round of stitches are in. We're going for round 2.
Ding 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 ding. Do you have a favourite musical?
I don't like musicals.
You don't like musicals?
No. Really, really bad queer person, aren't I? I don't fulfil many tropes other than looking. Right. Sleeve sewn in. We can now remove the basting stitches that were securing the sleeve. Careful you don't cut your actual stitches. That's all out. We can then finish off the shoulder pad and the canvassing. So because we've got a floating canvas in this one, we're going to be finishing off the canvassing process with this stitch. If you have a fused canvas, then obviously you don't need to worry about this, but you still need to worry about the pad placement and making sure that it is looking like it should. So you still need to do this stitch in any case. So what I'm doing here is the pad, shoulder pad, which comes all the way back there. I'm feeling for where it starts. I'm pushing the cloth out at the back of the arm, and I'm just making sure that it's sitting, that the cloth in between this section and the sleeve is nice and tight. And I can feel that the pad starts here, so I put a little stitch in there and I keep it nice and tight and out like that. So I'm just pushing out, making sure that everything, and I'm only catching the pad, I'm not catching the lining. So I've got the lining pulled out of the way, I've got my hand over the pad, and I'm just pushing out.
Like who's behind you?
Oh.
P wants to join.
So again, as you get to the top here on a floating canvas jacket, you're going to have to get through to the canvas and the pad. So make sure that your seam is pressed over like we did, and then push that out. And make sure you're catching pad and canvas at the same time. All the way out there, like that. And then as you get past the end of the pad, which ends here at the front, you're just catching the canvas, not the lining, just the canvas all the way around. Making sure that everything is spread out nicely. And then once you get to the end of your canvas, you can back tack. Next step, flip this and trim the shoulder pad, the canvas and the cloth past the seam allowance. So we move the sleeve in to the edge of this white mark. We need to chop everything that is now past this white mark. And you need to make sure you do so very neatly. So from this point here, I'm going to move the lining back And I'm just going to trim everything that sits beyond that white line. So you're not cutting the lining just yet, you're just trimming back everything else. So all of those thicknesses. Like that. Then you have something that looks like this. Make sure it's very even. If it's not even, you can always go back in and trim away any excesses that are sticking past. That looks pretty good. And now, all the way around where there's canvas and pad, so we just don't need to do it where the pad ends and where the canvas ends, so between these 2 points, we're going to catch the cloth into the canvas and into the top of the pad. Come on the seam allowance, so just past where you stitched. So that's my stitch there. So just inside of where I stitched my sleeve in. So within the seam allowance, I'm simply going to do a stitch like this, and I'm going to catch the top cloth and the canvas together. I'm not catching the lining, just the top cloth and the canvas together. And then as I come through the top, I can begin catching the pad as well. And this is securing the cloth of the body of the jacket into the armhole. And as you're coming around the back of the armhole, once the pad stops, you can stop doing the stitch. I've just reached the end of the pad there, and I can just back tack. There. Right. Next stitch is a similar one, but through the lining, so that the lining is attached against the body as well. So same principle. So this time we lay the lining up against the body and about 1/4 of an inch from the edge, so not 3/8 beyond, because that's our seam allowance and that's where we're going to be attaching our sleeve lining in, but 1/4 of an inch beyond the edge, we're going to do that same stitch, and we're only going to catch the top layers in, so just the canvas at this point. We don't need to go through to the sleeve. Now once you reach the base of the armhole, you can reach into the sleeve and the top cloth, but just make sure that you are sitting inside that seam allowance, otherwise this stitch will be visible. So if you look at my stitch going in, that's the stitch attaching my sleeve and my needle's coming inside of that. And just attaching that sleeve into place all the way around. And make sure that you're sitting inside the seam allowance at all times. You can feel where the stitch is on the underside, so it should be fairly easy to know where to put it. Right, so in this location, because we've narrowed the shoulder, we've got a little bit of excess lining, so let's just press it out flat like that. And we're going to be attaching the lining inside of that seam. And make sure you're not pulling the lining tight, you're just letting it rest where it wants to, and you're just stitching it inside the seam allowance. And here you're going to be latching it onto the shoulder pad.
Why can't someone pick me up on a white horse and ride me through the sunset?
now that we've done that, we can trim away that little excess of lining that's sitting beyond that edge, now that it's all secured in. So that's all sorted. And now we insert our sleeve head wadding.
I love this bit.
Do you really?
Yeah, it just cleans up everything. Pops it out.
So the sleeve head or sleeve head roll, which is this little thing here, is made out of usually canvas and some kind of demet or like foam. We're just going to press this flat. And I'm going to shrink this edge here and stretch this edge here so that it takes on the shape that I want it to. Now the reason why we do this is because once we put the sleeve head back into the armhole, we don't want this edge to create little pleats once it's in, and then for those pleats to be visible on the outside of the jacket. So we need this to be curved how we're popping it currently. Right, so let's remove these tiny little stitches that were left in. And now we're going to pop the sleeve head back into the armhole. So grab some thread, and this time we're going to double it over. So it goes in the needle and it doubles over at the end, so you create a knot with both strands at equal ends. Like that. So you've got an extra strong bit of thread. So we grab our armhole and we make a mark of where that front curve, so this is the front of the yarn, we make a mark where that front curve begins. So you can see it's curving here and it sort of stops curving about there, and that's where the sleeve head is going to start. So we then pop it in, so the folded edge goes against the raw edge of the armhole, and I pop that sleeve head there right into that mark, and then work it this way. We tack it in right behind our stitch mark or right on top of our lock stitch. I'm just going to come in here and just tack it in. The reason why this needs to be behind again is so that these stitches aren't visible in the sleeve. Now once that's done, we come forward a little bit, I bring the sleeve head back, I come in on the lock stitch or right behind my sleeve stitch, and I come out again at the same level right behind the sleeve stitch or right on top of the lock stitch. Then I lay my sleeve head edge to edge against the armhole and I pull my needle through. I then come back a little bit like a back stitch. So this is where it came out. I come back in a little bit further, put my needle in, make sure it's sitting behind my armhole stitch. So you can see my needle there. So it's behind my armhole stitch or on top of my lock stitch. And then I come back out again behind my armhole stitch, lay the sleeve head back in, and then pull my needle out. And what this will ensure is that your sleeve head is secured very close to your armhole stitch, but it'll also make sure that you're not coming through to the sleeve. And you do this all the way along the length of the sleeve head. Now you catch both layers of sleeve and 4-part top fabric for the body of the garment, and a little bit of canvas. There. Now, verify our work. Push that out, and you should get a sleeve which now has a little bit of a rope to it. Check our work, and that's looking fairly decent. Needs a proper press, but that's worked out nicely. Cool. The final stage then is to pop your sleeve lining back in. So at the front of the armhole, you've got the forearm seam from the sleeve coming here. Make sure that that lines up with the forearm seam of the sleeve lining, and then just wrap that over here and sew it back in where it was sewn initially, so about 3/8 of an inch in from the raw edge. Just wrap that over ever so slightly. Pop a pin in here, like that. Then come to the hind arm and do the same thing. So we've got the hind arm seam of the sleeve over here. You can see that coming through. We follow and match it up with the hind arm seam of the lining for the sleeve over here. We marry them together, and we make sure that they end up at the same spot there. And then we're going to baste the sleeve linings in. So grab some basting cotton and go around your sleeve, laying the sleeve lining 3/8 of an inch behind the raw edge of your armhole, or just inside of your lock stitch. Now you need to make sure, you can see how there's an excess of lining here as I come into my first pin on the hind arm. I'm going to ease that excess in so that that seam matches up on the sleeve lining and the sleeve cloth. Otherwise it creates distortion in the sleeve and things don't lay in very nicely. So we're just going to start easing in bubbles of fullness, just so those seams marry up perfectly. As I come into here, I can now remove my pin and carry on, going all the way around the armhole. Now it's important here that you add fullness as well across the top of the sleeve, otherwise it's not going to fit in, just like the cloth of your sleeve as well, which needed fullness. And then coming down to the other side, make sure that there's no excess length in there, or otherwise fill it in so that you get to that initial pin and things line up perfectly. Next step is to fell this lining down. Pin out, and here you want to be careful. You only want to catch the lining, particularly where there is no canvas underneath. Otherwise you're going to be sewing in the sleeve further down to the body of your coat, which we don't want. So I'm just catching the lining, and I'm just catching the sleeve lining. Catch body lining and sleeve lining to one another. Do not catch cloth, which lays beneath. Just come to the end here. So I'm just going to tack off. And there you have it. Now, my first button was up here. Make a crisscross where the mark is, over there. And I need to move it further in. So I'm just going to grab my notes. And I need my coat to wrap 2 inches. So I need to make sure that I keep the same level for the button, but that I'm wrapping it 2 inches in. So I'm going to come straight across the button, level, and I'm going to come in 2 inches from the front edge. Straight across, 2 inches in. There, like that. I'm then going to lie my buttonhole in line with this line that I've just created. And I'm going to lay the edge of the jacket up against that mark that I just made over there. So edge of the jacket against here, the line in line with my buttonhole. I'm then going to grab a pin and I'm going to pop it through the eye of the buttonhole. Pop the pin through the eye of the buttonhole, like that. Then carefully remove the front of the jacket, make sure the pin stays in place and doesn't move, and put it all the way through. Yeah. Next step is I'm going to grab my button, grab some thread, double it over so that it's strong. Yeah, so I've got double thread there. Knot it, and then come in through where that pin was placed. I can then take the pin out and pull my needle all the way through. I then come back up a little bit further out from that location, so like an 1/8 to the side, and that's my thread secured. And I can then start sewing on my button. So I come through in one hole, and then I come out the opposite hole to that. So I'm forming a cross shape. I then go back in, and then come back out, making sure I go through all the layers. You can see I've gone through all the layers because my needle's just visible from the other side. Now you can do this in 2 steps or in 1 step. You can see how my needle has come through all the way and has come through all the layers. I then pull. Now at this point, you don't want to pull the button until it's flat. You want to give it a little bit of wiggle room, the tiniest amount of wiggle room, and you'll see why in a second. So it's about an eighth of an inch off the surface of the coat. I then come back in through a hole that I haven't threaded yet, and then go back out through the opposite hole, and then again in and out of the body of the jacket, and just keep that button an 1/8 of an inch off the surface, and go and thread back those holes again in exactly the same fashion you did, going across one side and then the other, about 4 times each. There, like that. Once you've done that, you then pull the button up like this from the surface and you coil round 12 times on the stem of the button. You then maintain tension and you push your needle through the stem. Do this about 3 times. And then form a knot. Once, twice, and then go through one final time in the stem, and then snip the thread. Now your button is raised off the surface of the jacket, And what that means is when the button is buttoned into the buttonhole, there's enough room between the fabric and the bottom of the button for the other forepart to fit snugly beneath it. So I took the base out of the jacket and got an opportunity to try it on Luka just to check everything over. And I think the jacket needs an extra button over this one for aesthetic reasons. The first button should sit fairly in line with the waist of the wearer for it to draw the eye into the narrowest part of a person's frame. And in this case, it's sitting a little low for my liking. That's because the jacket was substantially longer and we've shortened it quite a fair bit, so all the proportions are tending towards the bottom. So what we're going to do is add a buttonhole and another button to heighten the proportions back to where they typically are. What you're going to need in order to make the buttonhole is buttonhole twist. Now this twist is a thread called a twist, and it's a twist because it's 3-ply, that is to say 3 little strands of silk that are spun together. It's slightly thicker than normal thread and comes on these little reels. I'm using specifically the Gutermann R753 variety, but you can use any other variety that's suitable to making buttonholes, and these are widely available in haberdasheries. So our first step is to measure what the distance between the buttonholes is. Now here I measure that from keyhole to keyhole, and I can see that it's sitting 3 3/4 of an inch apart per hole. So I start by bringing that measure up the jacket forepart. I then lay the forepart out and draw a line straight across from the front edge. The eye of the buttonhole sits a 1/2 inch back from the front edge. So I measure a 1/2 inch from the front edge and draw another line in. And then I measure what these buttonholes are. Typically front buttonholes are 1 inch long, and that is the case for these. And I'm now going to baste around the hole to make sure that the canvas sandwiched inside of the forepart, so between the front and the facing, is not going to shift. And I'm just going to baste it around like this, staying a good 1/4 of an inch away from the hole. Next step, grab a pair of snips, insert into the start of the hole, and then delicately cut your way in. Once you've managed to achieve a little gap, grab your shears and then cut that open properly. Split the hole open on the other side as well to the very edge of your chalk mark. And then right on the edge over here, we're going to make a little keyhole shape. So we're just going to cut out a tiny little square. It is very much tiny. And pull out what's left over. And what you should get is that little keyhole shape over there. It's ever so slight, and it's just to make sure that, just trim it out a tiny bit more. There we go. And it's just to make sure that the stem of the button can sit inside the hole. Then grab a matching thread and begin purl stitching the edge of the buttonhole to prevent it from fraying out. So I'm grabbing my needle here, I'm going inside of the hole, I'm coming out from the edge. We can trim these little strands here as we go along. I'm coming out from the edge a tiny little bite, and then I'm going back in a little bit further along, a bare 1/16 of an inch. I'm coiling my thread forwards in front of the needle and then pulling out. And I'm doing this process all the way along, coming in a bare 1/8 of an inch in front of each stitch I've just made, and again a bare 1/8 of an inch out from the edge of the buttonhole. Make sure when you're doing this that your needle is catching through to the other side. If it's not, then you're going to have a raw edge on the underside. So you need to be catching all layers as you're going along, especially this one here. As you come into your last stitch, pop your needle back in and back tack on the edge of the slit that you made. Then grab your twist and take about 2 arms lengths worth. So grabbing it there, 1, 2. It helps at this point to press the thread to stop it from being so coiled. So I just run it under my iron a few times. Knot the end, trim back the little excess, and then begin pearl stitching your buttonhole with the silk. So this time round, we're going to do the same process, but the stitches need to be far more regular and far more neat. I'm going to come into the hole and come out that same little bite in, then come a tiny little bit further along and pearl stitch and pull up. And repeat this process all the way along, making sure that your stitches are not far apart, don't come in too much, and definitely catch the other side of the buttonhole. Take your time doing this. It takes a while to get the knack of it, and it's likely that your first buttonhole won't be looking too neat. So you're more than welcome to practice before you set out making your final one. And then your last step, as you're coming into your last stitch, is to form a bar tack. Now a bar tack is what's going to prevent the slit at the end from coming undone. So start from this point of the row of stitches, coming through with your needle and coming out to the other side of the row of stitches, and form 2 loops like this in this area. Once those loops are formed, with the back of your needle, go under them and loop round all the way along to join them together. Once that's done, pop your needle back into the other side of the jacket, come up from the other side and simply back tack in place, and then trim your thread. Hey voila! And there you have a formed buttonhole. Remove your bastes and add your last buttons and your jacket's complete.